Hello and welcome. The Family from Eden is a series of programs that focus on the beginning of mankind, according to the account in the Bible. This is the 7th episode, and today we shall talk about Noah and the great flood that came upon the earth during his time. It's a dramatic story and leaves us with many questions to consider. I suppose that all are familiar with Noah. He was a shipbuilder, and he was perhaps the world's first animal conservationist. He was born 1056 years after Adam's birth as the eldest son of Lamech, and when he was born his father was 182 years old. And we find this story in the chapter 7 of the book of Genesis in the Bible. It is a story that causes marvel and perhaps disbelief for many. And some have wondered what the world may even have looked like before the flood. How the whole earth and even mountains could be flooded with water. And all the animals that were supposed to have been crammed together in a boat and being confined in a floating zoo for a whole year is also very hard to imagine. All we know about this voyage is that Noah released some birds in search for dry land. But in rabbinic literature there is also a story about a lion that injured Noah, so that after the flood he was for the most part unable to do any work. Now there are other questions. Where did all the water come from? And how could it possibly have rained for 40 days? The highest mountain, Mount Everest, towers 8,000 meters above sea level. And if the water covered every mountain, it would take several times the total amount of water on the earth today to cover them. So where did this water come from? And where did the water go after the flood? Are there any credible answers to this? Can we believe this story? To understand the flood and the consequences, we need to take a look at what the world looked like at this time. And the Bible explains the creation of the universe.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light, and God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. Then God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Thus God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. So the evening and the morning were the second day. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so, and God called the dry land earth. And the gathering together of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good.
So in the beginning, water was covering the whole earth before God told dry land to appear. And it seems clear that at that point the whole world was a single continent, surrounded by sea on every side. And there is no mention of any mountains or deep seas. But then God divided all the water into two parts. The water on the earth itself and a large body of water that he placed above what is called the firmament. The two parts were equal in volume according to the book of Jubilees. As much water was on the earth, God had also placed above the firmament. And we're talking about oceans of water. It was not ordinary clouds. So what does the Bible mean by the firmament? We get a clue in Psalm 19 verse 2, where King David says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament shows his handiwork." So to me it is clear that the firmament in the Bible is the blue sky above us, the upper parts of our atmosphere. The Creator had placed large quantities of water above this firmament. On the earth today there is a total of 1.5 billion cubic kilometers of water. That's about a bucket of water per second for 500,000 years. About half of this was placed somewhere in the sky, in the blue sky, above the blue sky. And the water stayed there for more than 1,000 years before it rained down. So it must have been in a stable form. There are different theories about the location of this water. Some believe that the water was in the atmosphere itself in the form of water vapor. People at this time were able to see the celestial bodies, the stars and the sun. So the water vapor must have been quite transparent. And this might have been possible if the water was in the hot upper parts of the atmosphere, where the thermosphere maintains a temperature of up to 2000 degrees. Others have rejected this theory because of Archimedes' principle in physics, which explains the uplift of a body when submerged in a liquid. This principle is valid also for gases. So large amounts of water vapor trapped in the atmosphere would have produced very high atmospheric pressure at the surface, to a level where our form of life could not have existed. So simple principles of science and physics prove that the water above the firmament could not possibly have been part of the atmosphere itself. Some others believe that the water could have been in the form of an ice shell or canopy above the atmosphere. One imagines a self-supporting bubble or cylinder with the earth floating inside. Now, if the shell was self-supporting, it would not affect the atmospheric pressure on the earth. So this may sound like a good idea. The ice would have turned the earth into a large greenhouse, which could explain the extreme fertility during the early days. Unfortunately, this is not a valid explanation either, because ice is not a stable medium for lasting structures. We see this in glaciers, which are constantly moving because of gravitational forces. I find it unlikely that a self-supported ice canopy around the earth would have lasted 1,000 years. So let's take a step back and look for other possibilities. It's a great mystery that fish and animals have been found throughout the Arctic, seemingly frozen to death within seconds. Even the coldest winter day in Siberia would allow animals to seek shelter from the cold. But what we find are entire carcasses of mammoths and other animals, as well as shoals of fish that turned almost instantly to ice. It is as if an enormous freezing hand was placed upon everything and everyone. Cold air could not have accomplished this by itself. A considerable mass must have been involved, for example in the form of supercooled ice. I've never seen a plausible explanation for this, but we shall keep it in mind as we look for other ways that the water may have been placed above the atmosphere. It has been suggested by some that a comet hitting the Earth could have left behind large amounts of water and ice. But comets travel fast, and when they enter our atmosphere, there is a lot of frictional heat that is generated that would vaporize any water it contained. So this could not explain the following ice age. So let's approach the problem from a different angle and ask the following question. Are there any other planets in our solar system that have water above their atmosphere? And to my surprise, it was not difficult to find. In 1610, Galileo Galilei discovered that the planet Saturn had a strange and beautiful system of rings circling it. And today we know more about these rings, for each ring consists of millions of small and large pieces of pure ice, which orbit around the planet. The inner orbits travel faster than the outer, and the size of the ice vary from millimeters to several meters, and all maintain a temperature of minus 200 degrees centigrade. NASA has calculated that the total amount of water represented by the ice around Saturn is about 30 billion liters. That is 3 followed by 19 zeros liters of water. This is about as much water as is contained in the South Pole ice cap. This amount of water is close to what we are looking for. And if so much water melted into the oceans, it would raise the sea level by about 50 meters, according to NASA. Such planetary rings exist around all the major planets in our solar system, but none are as visible or spectacular as the rings of Saturn. Some rings consist of particles of dust, and some are made of ice. And this has led many to believe that the Earth also once had such a ring. And there is actually some remains of a ring that orbits the Earth today. If there once was such a ring orbiting the equator, it may have looked like this. And water placed in this way can in principle have any volume without affecting the air pressure on the Earth. It could also be stable throughout the whole period in question. But in the end, something happened that caused the ring to collapse. And it might have been a collision with a meteor or another planet, or a near collision is also possible. An orbiting ring of ice can easily collapse because it has no stability of its own. It depends on a very fragile and finely tuned balance. Any obstruction for the outer ring would cause ice particles to fall towards the planet because of gravitational forces. But pieces of ice may then collide with lower orbits and build up an avalanche that would eventually collapse the entire ring. And all the ice would then fall to the ground as ice, hail, rain, and it may well take over a month. Such amounts of ice orbiting our Earth and having a temperature of almost 200 degrees below zero would have had an enormous cooling capacity. And if the ice could have been brought down to the Earth without melting, it could freeze an entire civilization in an instant. And the herds of animals and entire shoals of fish would freeze in seconds, which is precisely what we have found. During road construction in the far north of Russia in 1942, along the river Liglikata, an ice barrier was blasted, and the blast revealed a whole shoal of large fish that was frozen in situ in the ice while swimming. And the blast left chunks of fish meat lying around, and it was still edible. Large quantities of ice from space could explain all of this on one condition: that the ice could be brought down to the earth as ice without melting, and I wonder if it is possible. At an altitude of 36,000 kilometers above ground, orbiting particles would have a rotation that equaled the Earth itself. The centripetal and centrifugal forces would be equal. So the ice would appear to stand still at this altitude. And the ice falling from this height would fall straight down by its own weight. In the book of Jubilees, it is described how the rain which poured down from heaven formed 7 eddies or vortices, and I believe they insulated the ice from melting and provided a slow descent. And perhaps this is what happened and lasted for 40 days. Even with so much water falling from the sky, it was still not enough to explain that the whole world was submerged. The Bible points to another additional source of water. It rained from heaven, but there was also water coming out of the ground in large quantities. It was much more than groundwater. There's an American scientist, Dr. Walter Brown, who has presented a story about this. And he believes that he has found evidence for extensive connected pockets of water 6 kilometers underground. These contained large quantities of water compatible with what the Bible calls the fountains of the great deep. And there are some recent discoveries that support this theory. Because in the 1980s, some scientists drilled the world's deepest hole on the Kola Peninsula in northern Russia. They drilled down to a depth of 13 kilometers. And to their big surprise, they found a layer of crushed rock saturated with salt water at 6,000 meters. It was a big surprise because water was not thought to exist at this level. Both the high temperature and the high pressure spoke against it being possible. Groundwater can never reach so deep. And it was also strange that the granite was crushed as if the layers above and below had moved. And what they found was later confirmed in Germany, where another deep hole was drilled. So there are layers deep in the ground that contain water under high pressure and that at some point have shifted. Dr. Brown's theory agrees very well with the findings from these boreholes. And if he is right, then they have found the remains of the fountains of the great deep. Dr. Brown believes that there was a layer of water deep in the earth, a layer consisting of connected chambers of water supported by surrounding rock. And the total amount of water was perhaps half of all the water in the world's oceans today. And the water in the borehole was about twice as salty as seawater. Unlike the water from the sky, this water was very hot. It was measured at around 150 degrees. And under high pressure the water had not boiled. Then suddenly the crust of the earth cracked and the water started coming out. And for those inside the ark, this was an extreme situation. Cold water came from above and boiling water from below. Each could have killed them. But mixing the two produced a balance that saved the lives of those in the ark. But the fog surrounding the ark must have been very dense. The water was flooding the earth in wave upon wave, covering everything and everyone. And trees, plants and animals were swept away by the waves and left in thick piles where the waves turned. The world's largest mountain range is underwater, rising from the seabed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's called the Atlantic Ridge. This is where the earth cracked in a continuous zone around the entire earth. And the hot water from the deep gushed out in huge quantities, probably also lava and gases. And now the Earth's interior was pressing out and created mountain ranges of igneous rock and limestone, and while pushing other land masses aside, and whole continents were shifted, and new ones were formed. And the water stood above the highest mountain by 9 meters, according to the Bible. And this is the first mention of any mountains in the Bible. Nothing is said about how high they were. The amount of water indicates that they were probably no higher than 1,000 meters. The flood probably started with a storm where fine dust completely filled the air. Mammoths found in Siberia often have their lungs filled with a mixture of dust particles. And it was so dense that nobody could breathe, and there was no way to escape. Ice and rain poured from the sky, and all water in certain areas quickly froze to ice, and the permafrost would eventually extend many meters into the ground. It rained for 40 days, but the water kept rising for another half a year, because the water kept flowing from cracks in the ground, but then the water gradually subsided. The continents had drifted apart, leaving room for a lot of water, and on most continents we find a narrow continental shelf along the coast, but further ashore the seabed drops quickly down to about 4,000 meters, and this is the depth of the seabed of a large part of the world. And this is where the water settled after the flood. The great upheavals of the earth made room for all the water after the flood. Many have found the account in the Bible challenging. The old book contains eyewitness accounts of these events. It was certainly not easy to describe these new and unfamiliar events. It was a one-time event, unique in every way, never to be repeated. So what evidence is there that this is how it happened? Well, the permafrost for example, in Alaska or Siberia, can extend more than 400 meters into the ground. And very unusual discoveries have been made while drilling for oil, for example, in Alaska. Sometimes fresh wood would be found far below the surface. 1 meter of compact wood has been found at a depth of 600 meters. And the drill operators could hardly believe their eyes when the drilling machine started spitting out chips of wood that looked completely fresh but came from several hundred meters below. It was completely unexpected and totally out of place. The explanation may be that the large tidal waves left large quantities of wood in piles, and in a frozen state the wood never decayed. But in other places where the same thing happened and the ground was not frozen, one can find extensive oil deposits. Here is another example. William Buckland was a professor of geology at Oxford University in England in the first half of the 19th century. He had excavated a cave in Kirkdale, in Yorkshire in England. It was a large closed cave that had been discovered in a quarry, and on the floor of the cave, under a thin layer of stalagmite, there was a thick layer of mud containing bones and teeth from a variety of animals and birds. It was clear that the animals had not found their way to the cave by themselves. And Dr. Buckland believed that the thin layer of stalagmite and the fact that the animal remains had not decomposed pointed to a fairly recent event. He estimated that it could be 5,000 to 6,000 years ago that the flood placed the mud and the bones inside the cave. It was curious how animals that normally live in warm regions came to be buried together with animals living in the north. Similar discoveries have been made in the Tanana Valley in Alaska. where the valley floor consists of gravel and mud mixed with a huge amount of frozen bones from extinct animals. Dr. Rainey of the University of Alaska believed that the animals must have died during the Ice Age. And one can wonder what kind of event would cause animals to be torn apart and mixed with uprooted trees. Such discoveries have been made in many places. The north coast of Siberia is cold and inhospitable. For almost the whole year, ice covers lands and sea. There are no trees and people rarely visit. This part of the world was not covered by glaciers during the Ice Age, but has been frozen all the time since. And large quantities of mammoth tusks have been found here, to such an extent that it has become an industry. And half the world's ivory consumption has come from these cold shores. It's estimated that as many as 5 million mammoths were buried. And sometimes entire mammoth carcasses are found complete with skin and hair. They were buried in the permafrost since the day they died. And the meat has looked fresh and has been eaten by sled dogs and wolves without harm. This is how fossil and frozen remains of people, animals and plants may be found in many places. And the story is the same. Dramatic events wiped out all life. This flood was a one-time event. It was different from all other floods, and it cannot happen again. The Lord also said, I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. It did not rain until the water that was above the firmament was gone, and there had never been a rainbow. Those who lived at the time could not possibly understand why precisely the rainbow was the firm evidence that there could never come another flood like this. So this is the end of today's program. Thanks for now, and hope to see you next time. Goodbye.